Mixing with Mike plugin of the week is the brainworx BX console. This is actually an emulation of the Neve VXS console. Now, there's a couple of things here which I think are really extraordinary about this, aside from the fact that it's really a great emulation. This is a sort of, it's hard to even call it a tweener Neve, but I say that basically relative to what has been kind of out there and emulated in terms of the technology. I think people mostly know in terms of the Neve work is from the 80 series. So many of the EQs that extend from there, the 1073, the 31102, the 1081, all of those EQs that were classic parts of those 80 series Neve consoles from the 70s that were really amazing. And then you also see emulations of the 88RS, which was a much more recent, the most recent analog big format console by Neve that was done in the 2000s. But in between those two periods, in the mid-80s, Neve came out with the V-Series console, and the V-Series console evolved into a couple different things. It became VR, and then it was VRP, and then it became VX, and all of these things. So there was a sort of an evolution, and what this sort of marked was a period in which Neve kind of went out of a style of making consoles which included basically, mic pre, EQ, inline sort of setup, with their later 80, 81 series consoles, into a full console with more signal flow options in terms of flexibility, much more flexibility with the paths, signal paths, compressors and gates in every channel strip. And that was sort of one of the evolutions. And what I think was a shame, I've always been curious to know why a lot of this technology has not been emulated sooner, because those are really some amazing consoles and a real contrast for more pop music that was created up against the E and the G series consoles that were made by SSL. SSL had really come in and pushed Neve, and they were sort of these two powerhouses that really ran through the 80s and 90s in terms of the primary analog console manufacturers. And so there was some competition here, and people were very divided in terms of their Neve, people who just love Neves, or would never walk by a building that had an SSL in it, never mind go into a studio and mix on one. SSL people, I think, tend to be a little bit more open-minded. They liked Neves and were not so disgusted by them. But wherever you fall on those lines, the V-Series is a great console, and there's a lot to be drawn from it. And so what brainworx has done here is something that's really extraordinary. They happen to have their hands on a really good one. And apparently they use it for a lot of their plugin development, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who sneak in there late at night and do some mixing on this desk. So it's a great desk to kind of work on. A couple of things that are very unique about this: it's a channel strip plugin, and there are many channel strip plugins, but a couple of things that are unique, two basic things. There are a couple of added features which you don't have to use, which are thrown in there that give you sort of a twist and extended flexibility from the original hardware. So with analog hardware, there are always limitations based on the components, the ability to put in features and options and those sorts of things. Some of these things are underneath, that are little tweak pots that you have to actually pull the channel strip out to make an adjustment on, so they don't show up on the surface. And some of those features were made available by brainworx. But one other unique feature, which is the only console strip type that I've seen to do this, and I've wondered who was going to do it first and when it was going to happen, and I think this is the first one that I've ever seen, so I think it's quite cool. What is, I think, really unique, and I've thought this for a long time, and maybe the problem with many channel strip plugins is that every channel strip is identical to the one. So they come up with some okay, here's an E-series channel strip, and we just got a really kick-ass one. It specs out beautifully. So let's model that, get the best we can out of that, and then now you got the best E-series channel strip, and then you kind of do it. And it's very similar thing with a lot of the modeled things like 1073s and a lot of the EQs that are out there. But what I've seen very little of is someone deciding and looking at it and saying, you know what, but every channel isn't identical. and all the components are not exactly the same, and they don't spec out exactly the same, and there's a percentage kind of movement between all of the quality of those components and the way that those things interact, and not all channels sound exactly the same, and that's actually been factored in here. And this works within this section right here, where you can actually go in and you can set channel strip numbers up to 72, which is sort of crazy. And what that does is it creates the most subtle variation. Now, you've seen this in many plugins where if they have a stereo plugin of a channel strip where they give you like options to do a left-right. So you have those two, but those are the only two that you have. With this, you have 72 options. And while you may not find yourself toggling through to see which one sounds best on the kick drum, I think where it really comes across in is this subtle separation of sound and character for each unique channel and strip for each track. And when you set it up and you design it that way, it actually creates a little clarity. And I want to demonstrate a little bit of that. So what I've set up here, and let's just kind of go through the channel strip and get past some of the you know, kind of the brainworx toolbar, which is very cool. You got 4 storage points, copy and paste, and reset buttons, bypass within, undo, redo, all of those sorts of things. You can solo on stereo channels, mid and side, which is cool. So there's some cool options, but the channel strip itself is pretty true to the layout of the original. You have filters at the top. They are 12 dB per octave filters. What they added in to extend the frequencies, because I always felt one of the problems with the Neves was that the filters were limited in terms of frequencies. Like sometimes you just want to filter something to create like a megaphone effect, and going down to 7.5 kilohertz is not enough. So what they've done is added a divide by 3, which will bring it down to 2.5 kilohertz, which gives you much more extended range, a much better range. And the same on the low frequencies. When you do the high pass filter, where you only can go up to 315, and there's a ×3, which extends you up to 945 hertz. So that gives you a much tighter range where you can basically almost, you know, get yourself down to an octave area between 1 and 2K, more or less. So that's kind of cool, a nice little feature. You add the gate, which is in here. You can key it externally. So a lot of channel strips don't allow you to key the compressor externally. So you can actually set up an external key input. On the actual Neve console itself, it shows up as a separate patch point in the bay that you could patch into, which is kind of cool. So that gives you the ability to do external keys. It also has an invert thing, and you rarely see this. Is not even much in terms of plugin form, which is like a ducker. And that was the original idea of it. So if you leave it with a full range, then it basically cuts out everything except for, you know, what you would normally gate out. So it does the inverse of what you're doing, and that's obviously the name of the button, which is very cool. Now, there are 2 basic modes that you can kind of work with this in. There's an expander mode. So when the hysteresis is set all the way, and so here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this, I'm going to paste this right into here so we could see it. When this is set into expand mode, then you basically have a 2-to-1 or what I would call a 1-to-2 expander, right? So it's very subtle. And this is a soft type of thing that engineers use to get rid of tape hiss or to get just rid of analog noise that you would get from putting analog components on inserts. So this is something that was just like be a way of kind of shutting down any kind of noise that would be coming into the desk. And so you could use it in a very subtle way. Usually the way that I would use it would be to have a very long release, like for returns of gates and things like effects returns. Especially a lot of the vintage digital gear was very noisy on the output. You'd be surprised. And so you put that so when that reverb is not being used, there's a very soft shutdown, but it opens up very gently. Kind of cool. Threshold, it has a thing where you pull on the knob, and all this stuff is very true to the original. You pull it up and it adds or subtracts 30 dB from that threshold setting. So if this was -10, that would make it -40. And so that allows you to extend the threshold range by 30 dB. I'm sorry, one other thing, when you extend this out of the hysteresis, it goes and it becomes a gate. And when you do that, you actually have 2 thresholds. So the hysteresis control sets the differential between the open and close threshold of the gate. So you have a threshold control here, and then this is basically the differential between the open and close. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to set the open threshold, but now you can have sort of a natural decay before the closure starts. And this is really great, like on toms and things like that, where you don't want it to just like shut down sort of instantly as soon as the signal falls back below. And then you get sometimes weird effects when you're trying to put like set your release time accordingly. So you have the range control, which determines the floor or the bottom end where you hit. If you pull on this knob, you get a fast attack. There's a kind of an interesting thing here. With the gate, the fast attack versus slow attack is it's always quite fast. So it's either 1 millisecond or 100 microseconds, which is basically 0.1 milliseconds. So it's pretty fast on the attack, regardless of whether you're slow or fast. Sometimes one will create a little bit of a clip or a pop, and so you could flip to the slower attack, and that will kind of smooth out those types of things. So you just kind of see, for most stuff, it's really amazing the way that they laid it out. And the release time goes from 30 milliseconds up to 3 seconds. You can engage the gate here, and you see the expander gate metering here. It's on a stereo channel, so you see 2 meters. The limiter compressor can be placed in here. When you link this, now in the original console, it would link to modules going directly to the right. So it would sort of link, sort of complicated to explain, so I won't get too far into it, but it basically links the sort of threshold of the stages from left to right. So the idea, or from left to right. And I believe if I remember correctly, what it'll end up doing is whatever threshold is sort of triggered first or most, it will sort of work backwardly. So usually you would do this to tie sort of stereo channels. You got a piano left, right. You want them to be kind of tied together. And that's more or less the way that it's used here, so that within the same stereo plugin, the left and right sides will be sort of linked together. So as one threshold is exceeded, it will apply compression equally to the other side as it does to the right side. And there are some unusual things that you can get to with that with the original hardware, but because if you set different settings, it's not like it links all of the settings. It's very different because you could set different ratios and release times and create other weird effects that way. So I'm not exactly sure if that was modeled. I didn't look into that, but that would be something to check out to see how true that is to the original. Then you have makeup gain here. And later on, they added a hard knee option where you could pull this up and it would give you a hard knee control. That was not part of the VX. Then there is the threshold with the -20 setting. And you have the ratio here from 1 to 1 up to, it's like weird numbers like 97.4 to 1. Sounds like a radio station or something. But if you go all the way out, then that would be the limiting. So you have quite a broad range. And you notice that most of the flexibility is in that 1 to 1 up to 5 to 1. And then it very quickly goes up to limiting. And again, you pull for the fast attack. So you click on the little LED here, and you can kind of get that happening. The release time, again, is 3 to 3 seconds. Now, I will say one thing. When you put this to the auto setting, it will give you an auto release characteristic, so it will kind of follow the material, which can be kind of cool. So that's really helpful. One other thing here that's sort of unique, and is also was part of the original. So, and when I read the manual in terms of the layout of the plugin, it's a little bit different. Actually, the original has a 7 millisecond program-dependent attack, and so it will respond more rapidly to sharper transients and less rapidly to softer transients. So it's sort of an auto, or what they would call a program-dependent attack, but it can be varied in terms of its aggressiveness on that attack. In a fast setting, it would be down to that 0.1 milliseconds or 100 microseconds, or 1 millisecond in the slow setting. So generally, it's pretty fast. It just depends on the program material. So if you're looking for a little bit more of the VCA, like 30 millisecond pump that you would get like out of an SSL channel compressor or something, that's not what this is. So it's a little more designed to be more musical than that. And you can also get very aggressive. What's really cool about this is that they added in 2 things that actually make this work really much better. One is they added a separate high-pass filter for the side chain for the threshold, which is very cool because then you can filter off RMS material so that it can be more reactive to the transient material, which is quite cool. So you get this range here, which goes all the way up to 2K. That's a pretty broad range on that high-pass filter into the sidechain. And also there's a mix control for parallel compression. So you can actually, by default, actually on this particular channel, it's set to 64%. So I think this is a room track or something, so I'll show that. and demonstrate that, but you can get into some really heavy compression, get it to pump and breathe, and then kind of get that mix control in there. Some really cool stuff on that end. The EQ section, there's one feature that was added in here which is not part of the original. So on the original VX console, the signal flow order is filters, dynamics, which is the gate and expander, and then the EQ. And so the EQ would typically be after the compression, but there was no way to make it pre-compressor on compression. This was added in the 88RS when they updated that. But you could actually here hit the pre-dynamic switch, which would allow you to put the EQ, unlike the original console, in there. You have a high-frequency shelf, which can be made into a parametric EQ. With a high Q control, which narrows the Q bandwidth, very much like the 80 series Neves, like some of the later like a 1081 EQ, where you had those high Q switches in. That was like a feature to narrow the bandwidth and give you like a sharper kind of Q, and you get the same type of thing here. If the shelving is in, this becomes invalid. So this does not create any kind of resonance with the shelving EQ, so no confusion on that end. Otherwise, you got a straight parametric, boost, frequency, and bandwidth. You have to be careful here because just like the original, the frequencies actually kind of go around this way, whereas the Q controls and the gain controls go around the top. So it's sort of like you have to look at it here. So like the frequency is 190 to 2K. It doesn't go over the top. There's no area in here in between. So this is so you see just by the lines, you can see here we have the high mid frequency parametric, full parametric, the low mid frequency, full parametric, and then you have another low frequency shelving EQ, which can also be made a parametric with a high Q option. So you have a lot of control here in terms of the layout of it. Gain reduction for your limiter compressor shown here. Expansion is shown here. You have a VU metering in a sort of LED style format, very much like the original. And then you also have peak metering here, not the DBFS scale though. So you're getting you're actually getting, I'm not sure exactly what standard this is, but this is a DBV standard. It's sort of a peak metering standard, which usually peaks out at like plus 24. So sorry, I'm forgetting the call letters on that. Also, there's a phase inversion switch, which I love. Input gain control, which is really great. And then the V gain, this is actually on the noise, the natural noise characteristic of the console itself. So you can actually increase it or decrease it. They set it to sort of a default value of minus 85 dB. So it's subtle. It's in there though. And the closest you can get to getting rid of it is setting it to minus 20, or there's an actual offsetting, excuse me, where you could just turn it off entirely. And there's also a mute switch with the fader. So this gives you some ability to kind of automate and kind of work within the channel strip itself. No pan pot, but you'll notice here, this is kind of a cool thing where you could see the left, right, we're selecting the channel numbers, and I could just sort of toggle my way through all of these. You notice that there's a little toothpick that appears here on some of the channels, and that's what happens when the switch breaks. You could see one, let's see if I flip right there, so that would keep that switch in if it was broken. So you'll just notice that. It's just like one little fun thing. So it's not, not an accident that was left in there. But this is a way to toggle through some of the different settings or channel strips and kind of line them up. So what I've done here, and then we'll do a quick comparison. I just want to play some things, point out a few things that I've done with it, just so you can kind of get an idea of what it's capable of. And then we'll do like a quick copy paste, and I want to show you what the difference is and how this channel separation makes a difference. So we could kind of take out some of this analog mode stuff real quick and then do a comparison. I left it this way just so when we do it, if I make any tweaks or adjustments, those will be reflected in the second channel, so there won't be any differential with what's going on. I've also, for the sake of being realistic, there's a couple of effects returns, and they're not really that dominant in terms of the track layout, but I put these on those tracks just so that we could have something that was laid out here. It looks like I missed one channel, but I can make a copy of that there and just kind of drag that across. What are those channel numbers? 28, 29. Those are 29 and 30. So 27, 28. So let's just see. I'll just kind of go 31, 32. Let me also go back here to the room track because I think I made some unusual adjustments here. Let's go back to our setup A. And I think we should be go. So let's start by doing a listen, and then I'll just do a quick A/B out. So I've actually done a full thing with compression, some gating, in particular on the snare. I'll kind of preview, show a couple of those things, and then also some equalization. So I've kind of used it all the way through, and let's just kind of have a listen here to some of this. I think I'll start without vocal, and maybe we can add that in a little bit later. Okay, so it's harder to get into all of the individual components in, but just going to give you an overall idea of the vibe. One of the cool things about this is that it's a great combination of the warmth of the low end of some of those 80 series vintage knees, but also with the aggressiveness and edginess of a more modern console from the 80s. A real, and kind of like got still like a Brit ballsiness or kind of character to it. And so that's kind of the cool thing. So let's just kind of focus on a couple of things here. Like just with the kick drum, I did some normal EQ. Like I like using this high Q on the filter and on the low frequency. So I focus in on the fundamental, and you could do a pretty heavy boost on this. One of the things I like about analog components, you could really sort of crank in and kind of dial in some sounds a little more aggressively, and it never really seems to collapse, and I think that's one of the amazing things. Overall, all of the drums have a very similar compression setup. A little bit of makeup gain. I got the threshold set, sort of a light ratio, but sort of a consistent little pumping with a slow attack, and something that's about an 1/8 note release time. So it kind of has just like a little bit of movement that kind of drives the track. As you go through, notice the track number. So I have track 1 here, and then as I move this over here, I have track 2. Now on this, so let's just kind of solo up the kick and the snare. So I gated the snare down just so, and I may need to move up. So let's see. This is the snare. So the first adjustment I want to make is choking it down a little bit much. So I'm going to decrease the range. So what I have is like, it doesn't completely get rid of the bleed, but it chokes it down a little bit. And on the snare bottom, I did a similar thing, except for I choked it down a little bit more aggressively. That way I can get that top end to kind of just push through. And I compressed it a little more aggressively. Or usually what I like to do here is compress it a little more aggressively. Let's just try that right here. Here's where we can use that. And it gives like a real like gritty character to the sound. Now this is actually an example here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this. This is like like if we really want to kind of make this pump a little bit, I'm just going to copy this, paste it into the B channel so we can kind of do a quick A/B. This is a place where I could also take this get really aggressive with the limiting here. And do a parallel with it. So it's really cool with that. And then I just, you know, in terms of just pull a little bit of the boxiness out, like somewhere around like 500 cycles. That's most of what I did in here. Not a whole lot. Added like a little bit. I like adding like some air on this. It's like a great way to bring in air on something. You crank that frequency all the way up to the top, and then on a shelving EQ, because it's up so high, when you do that boost, the Q just sort of extends that down almost like a tilt EQ. Kind of a cool technique, and it works really. It's a great way to add sort of presence into a drum kit, or air into a drum kit without getting harsh, because as soon as you start getting down into that 8K range or in there, you start to get like that ping on the rides, which can sometimes be annoying, or maybe you need that. And then I also have some I just love this on toms, just because of the you can really dig in, and like when you kind of boost those fundamentals with that tight Q, you just get like a really, like a rich kind of warmth out of it, and a nice tone. And back where we started, this is the room track where you can see with the heavy limiting, and I probably left a little bit more in the mix control, almost 2/3. And if I want to feed this EQ pre-dynamic, sometimes this is like a cool way of making the EQ more efficient, like where you just kind of set it in so that when the EQ or the compression kind of grabs onto the signal, it is the compressor is you got filtered out a lot of the stuff that you don't want, basically, is what I'm kind of getting at. It's a little bit more open on that end from there, so I'm just going to leave that after the EQ, so that's kind of attenuating some of that. Really cool stuff here. This is also like one of the classic things I love more than anything, especially from some of the 80 series Neves. It's like a richness of bringing in that warmth of the low end of the bass, just on that shelf. And that filter down there on the bottom end is kind of a nice way of sort of softening some of that. It's a very common thing. I like to use filters on the low end and also on the top end on a lot of tracks. It helps to keep your low-end drivers from working too hard, especially for instruments that don't need those frequencies. So keep them for more for like kick drum and bass and some of the sub-frequencies that can use that energy. What's really cool also about this with the EQ is that you can really kind of dig in and get some frequencies here. So let me just kind of, and where you can really dig in with the EQ. One of the other things I like about this, particularly on things like guitars, and kind of dig out a tone, but it still kind of comes together and sounds musical. Sometimes with that, there's so much of a phase shift that it sounds weird. This is like a nice warm kind of phase shift where it's not where even when you do sort of radical amounts, it never really feels like harsh, yet it still feels aggressive. And that's like another like you know, classic characteristic of the BX components. So a very, very cool one. And then we also have a couple of organ tracks here, and we can kind of mix these guys in. And all right, so now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to set this up so that everything is always set to one channel. So I'm going to do a quick thing here. I'm going to bypass them as I go along, set everything to channel 1. Now there's two ways to do this, because you can actually just like to do a comparison, because you're not going to be able to gang them together, but you can also just toggle in and type the number. So you can go all the way up to 72, maybe as you kind of like have bigger sessions and you kind of lay this out. So if I make this one, actually for this I can just take it to analog and it will keep both channels the same, or take the analog switch off, and what that does is it will make both channels the same. So and I'll show that again here. So let me just kind of put that to 1, and this will kind of give you a little bit of a better idea. I think we've got a stereo channel coming up here in a second, and so let's just do this, and no extras in there. All right, so here's one of the stereo channels, and so as we do this, you see if I go to the analog switch, it'll make both the same channel number. So that would be like the identical characteristic, no variation between the left and the right side. And you can kind of experiment with that, but you'll definitively hear the that characteristic kind of coming out. So let's just see here. And again, even though this is just like a simple component here, I want to show this because it'll really give you an idea of what this difference is between the two. And so the other thing is that this is not rehearsed, which makes it that much more fun, because if it sucks, it's just going to blow up in my face, and that'll be cool too. But I'm very convinced in just my working with it and working with some of the individual channels, this is actually going to be really great. So let's just dig it onto here, and maybe I should have done some of them. Yeah, well, whatever. Can't win them all. But anyway, there's a lot here, and if you've had experience with working with the Neve console, because this was like a really big competitor to SSL. There's sort of this idea like every record ever made back in the 80s and the 90s were all done through SSLs, and that is not the case at all. There really were a lot of people who just wanted nothing to do with SSL consoles. And I was not one of them. I was a big fan of that. Actually, we're not going to do the vocal here, so I'll just kind of stop there. But what we'll do is I will give you just with this basic layout. Let's start, and what I'll be able to do here is I'll be able to bypass. This will be the analog phase. This will be the digital. So I'll be able to kind of. Hold on 1 second. That was fun. Let's just show my inserts. There we go. And then I think I also collapsed my sends. Yeah, got to be careful about where you hit there. Okay, so those guys are all good. All right, so here we go. So what we'll do is you can hear the noise that kind of goes in there. So I can bypass these guys, bypass those. So this will be analog. So we'll kind of go back and forth, and I'll do it kind of as quickly as I can. And let's start from the beginning. Okay, so take that in, and now let's do the same thing. And this is all in digital, so all with the identical settings. So I think what you can hear there is a little bit more of a generic quality. Now I'm going to try to go back and forth a little bit just so you can kind of hear the differences here. I didn't do that at first. You can rewind this if you just want to kind of get just like a quick A-B to go back to the other. But I think when you hear this again, you'll hear this difference really kind of kick in. Just more openness and depth. So I think you can really hear that difference, like that subtle variation of the components. All the channels are going to have their own unique settings. It's just something about it where it is just like that each component doesn't have the exact same movement, shape, whatever to it. It's really, just kind of really amazing the way that it's laid out. I think it's such a cool idea. It's very unique. And probably the truest thing to what really happens. I think there's also things like this that follow through with like tape emulations, all the tracks being not identical to each other. All analog components are like this, and this is like a real game changer in my mind. I really dig this. It's a great console, a classic console. I'm surprised nobody has really done this before. A great channel strip, great job. By BX putting this together. Can't give it high enough praise in terms of that, and the usability, the visuals, the graphics are really great. Sometimes that can be a little bit confusing when you're working with the plugins. One final quick thing that I didn't mention here, just as I saw it, there's a secondary release, which is actually part of the original, which allows you to shape the release time characteristic when working with a compressor. So that secondary release, instead of working on a linear scale like the first release, like the main release control that you have here, this actually works on a more rapid scale. So it's going to be more aggressive in terms of how rapid it descends. Logarithmic scale, I believe, is exponential. I'm sorry, that's the way that they laid it out. So it's going to cut off real fast. So when you set that, you could set a separate relative threshold that goes from 10 to 60. And the default setting on their console, they claim, is 40, although when you call it up, it comes to a default of 20. That'll just allow you to kind of shape or kind of, control the shape of the release characteristic of the compressor, and that will become more or less apparent depending upon how aggressively you use it. Really great plugin, and I know this was a really long plugin of the week, but it's hard to kind of do a short version of this with audio examples and not have it be you wanting more. Really great one. brainworx. BX console, an emulation of the Neve VXS console. Really great one, and a real game changer in my mind. Really dig this one. All right, there you have it. Plug-in of the week.